Okay, hi everyone. A very warm welcome to the session, the role of private sector in achieving SDGs, challenges and opportunities. I can maybe get started by saying this is going to be the best session. So that is there in AEW. I know Mark said the same in his session, and I disagree with him. So for all of you who have joined the session, thank you so much. I know you are very dedicated in understanding what private sector can contribute towards SDG, because this is right after the lunch. So thank you for joining. We have a stellar lineup of speakers, so I will quickly introduce them as well in a minute. My name is Sohini. I am from Clear South Asia and DEval South Asia. I will be moderating the session, but I'll get out of the way in the next 5 minutes after giving you the motivation of what we are going to chat about for the next 1.5 hours. But we will really hear from the wonderful panelists who have agreed to join the session. So just to quickly introduce them, and they will also be speaking in that order. So we'll first hear from Dr. Christopher David Nelson. He is the manager in Infrastructure and Sustainable Development Unit at IEG at World Bank. He also manages evaluation portfolio for the sustainable development and infrastructure global practices of the bank. We have Dr. Henrique Pissaia. He's the principal professional specialist in evaluation methods at IEO at New Development Bank. Previously, Henrique was the staff of Brazilian Ministry of Planning and held positions on the board of directors and governors in various MDBs and funds. And finally, we also have Dr. Sven Harten. He's the Deputy Director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation, or DEval, and heads the Competence Center for Evaluation Methodologies, as well as the ECD program there. And I would also love to hear, because he was also in the previous session, what he thought, which session is better. Maybe at the end we can hear from him as well. Okay, so just to kind of quickly set the motivation and the context of why we are talking about private sector at all in this conference. So I wanted to maybe take a minute to quickly chat about what is CLEAR in case you don't know what CLEAR is. So CLEAR is essentially, it was set up in 2010, and it is coordinated by the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. We are based in South Asia, so DEval South Asia. Our broader mission is to strengthen M&E systems and capacities and the use of evidence, and we are planning to do that with our work with the private sector as well. Most of our work is with the government, but we are also trying to expand the portfolio of our work. And we are also a partner of Global Evaluation Initiative, or GEI. Okay, coming back to what all of you would hopefully learn by the end of this 1.5 hours. So we are planning to chat a little bit about the role that the private sector can play in reaching SDGs. So thinking about what the development community can do and how they can support better, how M&E can play a critical role in this regard, and we are going to speak a bit on that, and also the value of partnerships with the private sector. I know this is something we spoke a little bit in the conference, particularly in yesterday's plenary session. There was a mention of that, so we are going to deep dive into that point as well. And finally, we are going to touch upon some of the initiatives and future direction that World Bank, New Development Bank, and DEval and CLEAR is taking in this regard. Okay. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about SDG financing. So many of you know that SDGs have 17 goals. But I think more broadly what we are seeing is the financing gap is expanding, particularly in developing countries. And there are some sectors, for example, energy, water, and sanitation, where it is getting more and more pronounced. So the annual, according to UNDP estimates, the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries have grown to $4 trillion US. And here is where the private sector can contribute, particularly to SDG financing. So just in terms of scale and consequence of reach of the private sector makes them an important player. They are where most jobs are, so 90% of the jobs globally are here. They are a big employer, producer, emitter, so the reach of private sector is just vast, and so is the potential. When we think of global investments overall, we see that when it comes to sustainable investing, so that is when investors consider ESG criteria in their investment decisions, it outstrips net official development assistance by at least 150 times. I also wanted us to kind of recognize that although we are talking about private sector as a whole, there is a lot of diversity in the sector. So depending on where you are, you can be a commercial first or an impact first. You can be a company or an investor. So based on where you're based, your entry point to SDG would vary because some of the challenges that you are facing within the organization and your approach is also very, very different. So to give you an example, an investor who is a commercial first, so it can be a traditional investor or an investor considering ESG factors. The sector is highly focused on regulations. That's typically on the trend that we see. But when we look at impact investors who are looking at positive social and environmental impact alongside financial returns or profit, we see that there is some traction when it comes to impact measurement. But again, it is grossly, very diverse in that sense because there are some who are more rigorous than the others. There is also a rise in sustainability in business. So an SDG offers that lens where companies think about creating positive social and environmental impact. Sometimes the rationale can be just a moral call. It can be, just the changing consumer interest, or it can be coming from investor or just plain and simple regulations. But here again, just to bring it back to the room and the M&E community overall, there is a lot of a big role that M&E can play. So there are some common challenges that a lot of private sector companies, they face uncertainty about on what approach to take and which are more counterintuitive. So things like how do they manage energy transition, how can they think about worker well-being or engagement, or how they can think about resilience of the supply chains. And here again, there are opportunities for thinking about using rigorous scientific evidence, particularly from impact evaluations. The second opportunity that I'm going to briefly touch upon, but we will have the experts really speak to that, is on the point around ESG. So more broadly, ESG are a set of standards that businesses use to measure their impact, particularly around issues of environment, society, and governance. There are about, and this is according to UNDP estimates, there are about 600 ways to assess corporate ESG activity. So there is a lot of diversity, which also means that it makes it that much harder for people to rely on, for investors to really take it seriously. So it makes it a very opaque framework. And here again, I feel that there is a lot of value that measurement and M&E community can bring in by developing clear standardized metrics, and that can be a big contribution that we can have. And finally, the last point, before I open it up for their remarks, is how we as Clear South Asia have been thinking about this. So for us, a lot of this thinking is still at the conceptual level. I think more broadly, the goal that we want to see and reach at some point is the fact that companies and investors are effective partners in reducing poverty. And that's probably something that maybe all of you may be thinking about in your respective organization. So some of the outcomes we hope to see is for example, use of evidence in sustainable business practices or when impact investment decisions in driving capital. And then also the other aspect is use of innovation, which is also a sub-theme of this year's AEW, right? How companies and investors can contribute to social policy innovation. For us, there can be a number of pathways or entry points. One such pathway for us that we are going to work on this year at Clear South Asia is doing a capacity building or a M&E workshop with companies and investors, helping them think through how to use impact evaluations to drive sustainable social impact at scale. So what they can measure, how they can measure, and how they can interact with and really leverage global evidence and in the sector on what works and what doesn't, and how they can use that in their own work. So with that, thank you so much for joining the session, and I will maybe request Chris to maybe share his opening remarks.
Thanks very much. Again, it always feels a little funny when you're asked to sort of participate in a session and be the voice for a whole bunch of people back in Washington that probably know a lot more about this than I do. But at the same time, I think it's always nice to engage in part of the work that we do in the evaluation group at the World Bank that we're a little less familiar with. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret, and I know my boss is not in the room, so I'm allowed to get away with this. I am a massive skeptic of the International Finance Corporation. I have always found it difficult to get any staff member within IFC that can give me a really good story to tell about the additionality of IFC investments. And so we often pride ourselves in the IFC on the idea of repeat customers. But for me, the real challenge is thinking about the leverage and the nudge, if you like, of what you would expect the IFC to do to stimulate business thinking about its contribution in a different way. Now, I must admit that skepticism has been diluted a little bit, which is nice, over 10 years or a bit over 10 years in the bank. But it's still something I kind of have some tension with. But what was so fascinating is when I asked my colleagues back in Washington to send through some of their thoughts on today's topic, it was really reassuring that a number of the examples that they sent through were ones that were very much about partnering with the World Bank. And so when we're actually coming back to the presentation that we just had, I think the 4 quadrants for me is really telling. I don't have any doubt that the new president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, is very much working in the bottom left-hand quadrant, which is the commercial. So while we like to believe that there's a whole bunch of foundation stuff that's out there and a whole lot of companies that are driven by ESG, for me, I think the really telling stories that have begun to emerge through the evaluations that we've done in recent years, and we'll get to some concrete examples a bit later, has been in regards to when we've thought about doing things differently to ensure that the private sector is given an opportunity or an entry point that makes financial sense, that actually stimulates the way that they go about their business, and that is motivated by what they're really looking at, which is financial returns. And I think that notion of working in tandem is a really good example of what we have to kind of concentrate in regards to the contribution to SDGs. Because you go out, the vast majority of our clients, you ask them about SDGs, they barely know what you're talking about. So in a way, and the record is patchy. If you look at West Africa in regards to engaging with many of the French water companies and privatization, it was a disaster. Where I think the more evident success recently has been is in the use of different instruments, such as guarantees, which I think have worked very, very well. And I think the second thing is rejigging or getting companies to run ahead of the curve. And I think this is very evident in regards to both Asia Pacific, but also Africa in terms of telecommunications, and also in regards to energy transition. And we're about to undertake an energy access evaluation. And what's wonderful in regards to that is that the approach paper I sent to the rest of the bank yesterday, and one of the really fundamental factors in that is that we're interested in looking at making comparisons between off-grid, mini-grid, and centralized grid, and looking at how to transition that, but much of it is about what role the private sector plays within that. And I think that whole resetting of what we're trying to do with the evaluation is trying to look at it through a lens of what does the private sector need to better understand to actually make its business entry for World Bank projects much, much greater. So I think that's very much the essence of what I think World Bank brings on this, but we've got a whole bunch of questions that are going to come up, so I'm going to hand over to Sven.
And having been at IFC for 7 years, I can definitely share your concerns and doubts about additionality. That has always been a very, very different conversation, and also, I mean, it's still for operations, it's a hard thing to prove, right? I mean, if an elephant such as IFC comes in with an investment proposal, how do you know whether the other investors are coming because you're coming in, or whether they would have come anyway? So it's not an easy story to tell. But I guess my main story is, if you're looking at private sector contribution to SDGs and the role of evaluations or of M&E, we really need to think much, much harder about ourselves. So I think we as evaluation practitioners, we have to transform. We have to do a better job. We have to help operational colleagues with the narratives, and we need to become much more agile. Sometimes when we go to, and in the rare cases where we meet private sector clients, we're speaking in jargon, and if you're talking about outcomes and impacts, you lose them in a split second, right? So I think, in terms of perhaps like an IPDET training course or other training courses for evaluators, I would love to see a private sector person teaching evaluators how to engage with the private sector, because I think we really have a long way to go still, and saying this after how many decades trying to evaluate. So it's not the private sector who has to change. First we need to change and have to move away from bean counters, and then we'll see that there are ample opportunities. So for instance, most countries do market research. So what is market research? It's a baseline, right? So, but if you come and pitch a baseline, they're going to be like, oh, what impact and RCT and whatever? Oh God, no. But if you're saying, hey, we can help you to do a really good market research so that you understand your customers even better, we put that on a scientific basis, then they have a useful product. But in most cases, we're not pitching it in this way. And in that same fashion, I think you're going to talk about this a bit as well. What is really cool about working with the private sector, I mean, they get experimentation. If you work with governments and you talk about experimentations, most governments are going to be like, oh, well, Sohini, you'll know, right? Political risks and however, how should I do this and so on. And private sector is like, yeah, sure. I mean, we want to test this product. And so there as evaluators, again, we have an offer. And we have a really cool, robust product with RCTs where we can help the private sector to become better in their business. And also, I think in terms of the qualitative work, even though I do like the quant part, but also the qualitative work. As evaluators, sometimes we need to switch our mindset a bit. Like in the private sector, you have customer-centric design. Well, what is this? This is based on some ethnographic methods, right? It's based on participant observation, right? It's developing a small thing, throwing it out to the customer and sitting next to the customer and seeing how they're using it, right? So it's participant observation, and we're, as evaluators, we're good at that, or we're good at customer interviews. So I think in that sense, I think my main message is, if we want to support the private sector to contribute even more to the SDGs, to reduce the financing gap, we shouldn't look at them. We should look at us first. And just a last small footnote, I do have a problem with all those financing gap reports, I must say, because wherever you go, there's a financing gap. There's a financing gap on climate. There's a financing gap on financial inclusion. This morning we had the financing gap on food security, right? And now on all the SDGs. So yes, of course there are financing gaps, but also many of those reports are written by people with a negotiation mindset or with a sort of political purpose, right? So we need to get better at the things we are doing, and we as evaluators, we have some tools to improve the impact of the funding that is out there, rather than always saying, oh, we need a couple of more trillion and it has to come from the private sector. Maybe if we are as development partners, if we can really show, and that goes back to your point about IFC narratives, if we can really show narratives about, whoa, here we're creating big impact, then the private sector will come, but we're not telling those stories good enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohini, and thank you, Clear, for inviting us. It will be difficult to speak something after Christopher and Sven, but Christopher said something that he has some more freedom since his boss is not here. I have a bit more freedom because my boss is in the other conference, so he cannot appear at any moment. So please, if you have any questions, ask me. And all my colleagues are not here, so all my colleagues are also there. So nobody will say that I said something bad. Firstly, let me do some institutional propaganda or some marketing for ourselves, just to fool what's expected, and then I give some personal views, taking advantage that my boss is not here. So basically, the bank, the NDB, we set some targets in the strategy, 2022-2026. So we set some targets for climate change and mitigation. So 40% of the funds for 2022 to 2026 should go to climate mitigation adaptation. Also, 40% of the staff should be composed by female. And 30% should be local currency. Local currency is not directly linked to ESG, but it's an important target because also we try to promote local markets and local bonds that they can be used. When you link one thing to the other, you can start making green bonds and sustainable bonds in BRICS countries, because the bank is from the emerging and developing economies. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now 3 new members. Bangladesh, Egypt, UAE, and probably Algeria and Uruguay are entering the bank as soon as they ratify. So also the bank has, from the 6 key sectors, 5 of them are linked to ESG. So transport, clean energy, sustainable transport, clean energy, water and sanitation, social development, and environment development. The only one that's not really linked with ESG is digital transformation. So it's in the DNA. All the projects have SDGs linked since the strategy 2022 to now on. We have some challenges, of course, and then different from IFC. Also, the biggest challenge we have inside our bank is that the accounting is together. So IFC is designed to private sector. World Bank is to public sector. We have everything together. So it's really hard to leverage funds. And it's really hard to invest in private sector, invest in small companies, because then you have the risk of your balance sheet doesn't look that positive. And then we are AA plus. So then our cost of capital becomes much more expensive. And then if we start providing more and more and more to private sector, our risk goes up, and then our ratings will go down. And then if the ratings going down, the capacity to provide cheaper loans starting to be more and more difficult. So it's a challenge. It's a real challenge, but we have in our strategy that 40% will go there, and 30% should go to non-sovereign operations. So non-sovereign operations doesn't mean only private sector, but also financial institutions and local financial institutions. That maybe it's a tool, maybe they are a nice way for you to mitigate this. I can talk about this a little bit later, how we can use national institutions. In case of Germany, you have KfW. In our case, we have like BNDES, DBSA in South Africa, even in India, Exim Bank, that can be used as a tool for us to have this money go into the private sector. But just my final point for this introduction is Sven talk about the importance of private sector, of clear, and I would like to emphasize also the academia. Like we didn't talk about academia, and two things we didn't talk in this conference at all, in any panel that I listened. We didn't talk about academia, we didn't talk about the DEval South or the DEval Youth, so young people, young populations. In some other conference I've been, they emphasize a lot about the importance of the new evaluators and the new comers, and at these, especially the panels I attend, I didn't listen that much. So academia and young people. But why? Exactly what Sven said. We as banks, we are a bit stuck. We are a bit with our hands tied. We cannot innovate that much. We don't have space to innovate. Because as I was saying, we have AA+. If we start innovating and it fails, the market doesn't forgive us. The market punishes us. We don't have this space. And academia, civil society, and when I say civil society, I'm not just saying the minority society. Civil society as a whole, clear, or the NGOs that are not advocating, some advocating, some not. You have the space to try. You have the space, academia, youth, and civil society have the space to try, to fail, and have the support from the government and from the multilateral development banks or the national development banks. So this is one point I would like to raise here. So private sector is important, but we need to fail, and we usually as public sector, we cannot fail. Private sector and the others, especially academia, can fail.
All of you, it was so nice to hear your thoughts. I think before we open it up to the audience for Q&A, I have a few questions that I wanted to really use your brains, combined brains, to help me understand. I think first, if I can start with you, Sven. I think you mentioned a very important point that in order to work with the private sector, we need to speak their language and not really talk at them. You mentioned about how we as an MNE community, we end up talking in jargons. I think thinking a little bit on enabling environment to make that happen, right? So can you help me understand, what policy changes would you recommend to essentially have a more enabling environment for private sector to contribute towards SDG?
I'm glad that Henrique mentioned academia, so I can have my academia hat on and answer with, well, that depends, right, which is sort of the classic answer. But no, I mean, honestly, of course, it depends on the specific market that you're talking about, right, and different market failures in different countries. So what I would say is one, just generally as MDBs, as bilateral donors, as the evaluation community, both in the global north, but more importantly in country, we should pay much closer attention to the market failures of the private sector. you know, it's quite rare that you have evaluation or reports by evaluators that just broadly assess market failures in a country. And I think we should work closer with think tanks so to get the understanding about what is working well for the private sector in my country, in the market I am in, and sort of get the knowledge from academia in from think tanks and really build on that knowledge of the market failure so that already at project design we can assist and help our colleagues with independent evidence about those market failures. So this is just a general answer, and then just much more specifically and a bit linked to what I said before about the financing gap. You know, depending on what kind of study you're looking at, but sort of leveraging private financing from public institutions across the board has been quite disappointing. You know, we did a study on blended finance a couple of years ago. There we had a relatively okayish ratio of 1-to-1. There are some studies where across the board it's actually much less than $1 of private funding leveraged. Some specific products, some specific funds you may have much higher leverage, but across the board mobilizing private funds is not working that well. And then again, taking much more sort of a domestic lens, I would say for a bilateral donor for us in Germany, there are lots of regulations that make it difficult. So just for instance, to set up a blended finance fund, right, is nowadays, I mean, since 2 years, it's actually possible to have something viable in Germany. But before that, it wasn't. And to my knowledge, there are probably like 3 funds now done by KfW. So the regulations for innovative financial instruments, at least in Germany, they're much more strict, much too strict. So we have our own market failure, which leads to that we can't develop innovative financial products to support the private sector in partner countries.
Okay, clearly I don't know how to use this. So I think you spoke about the work that NDP does and the fact that both private and public are together, unlike how World Bank functions in this regard. So my question is, because you work with IEO, so from the evaluations that you have undertaken, can you talk a little bit on how you have helped private sector understand their role towards SDGs?
Thank you, Sohini. Yes, one thing that since the inception of the new development bank, we need to position ourselves in the market. We need to find a way how to leverage the fund. And again, we've in the last 9 years we approved $35 billion in projects, but then. We have only 9 years. We have to compete with, not compete, but the fiscal space of the countries are really limited. So they have to decide which funds they are taking. So one way that we found to work with private sector and to work with our countries is using these national development banks or national intermediaries. So development banks in the country, some countries like Brazil, where I'm coming from, we have subnational development banks. We have a lot of state development banks. They have an important role in development. And they have this last mile, as they call. So they go and they borrow money to micro entrepreneurs, the SMEs. So they provide the funds for this last intermediary, the private sector. So we start using them as a tool to achieve the private sector. So 27% of our operations are through this kind of national intermediaries. In Brazil, the key one is the BNDES, that's Brazilian National Development Bank. In South Africa, the DBSA, that's the National Development Bank of South Africa. And then we have these ones in the states of Brazil. So this is a clear way how we have been working together. Then through the evaluations, we did some evaluations. We did the bank, again, I'll keep repeating this, the bank is new, 9 years. It's really hard to evaluate. We're in an evaluation forum. So how can you evaluate a bank that has 9 years and implement projects in the public sector? In 9 years, basically no project is completed, and then you don't have 2 years after the projects are completed to see the impact and so on. So we start to do a lot of real-time evaluations. We start doing a lot of almost completed project evaluations. Then, of course, we have to limit the impact approach we have in our evaluations. And we did one in DBSA in South Africa, one in BNDES in Brazil, and that we saw that we use the bank as a tool to leverage private funds. So I give you a concrete example. In Brazil, the project was in renewables, wind and solar panels. Then what was the bank's strategy? The bank said, okay, it's only $300 million. So with $300 million, you have to benefit at least 4 final beneficiaries, and then you have to leverage. So BNDES was responsible to have funds from private sector to leverage these investments. And these investments were also to private sector. So and then also limited open geographical approach. So the projects were benefiting 3 different states in the country. So when the bank did the project preparation, it sets all these goals that, okay, you have to leverage from private sector. Then the BNDES leverage $1 billion. So almost 4 times what we invest from our side. Having a broad scope, so a broad coverage, so several states. So this is really important for how you design the project and how you design the project. Because especially when you're talking big institutions, big banks, the banks want big projects. They want big impact. They want to, okay, let's have a subway that everybody will see, that we can advertise and so on. But sometimes that's more hard, or it's harder for you to develop SDGs, because then, okay, you're just looking for one single project. When you have this broader scope, then of course the teams are not happy because they have more work to do. They have to go to more places. The cost of the project preparation is higher. The research you have to do is bigger. So everything's more difficult. So of course, private sector doesn't want that much, and also the public sector doesn't that much. So this is one of the innovations we are doing, and this is what we identify in our evaluations.
So if I can turn to you, Chris, I think, so there is one question that I've always struggled with, and if you can help me understand that, is, and I'm here talking particularly about commercial side of private sector, so who have a clear profit motive. So how can they balance profit, and then they have, the consumers to please, and then you throw in, environment and social responsibilities, and particularly when they can be at odds with each other?
Okay, so I think I'm going to give you 2 recent examples. One of which touches on the de-risking part. So we've recently done a thematic evaluation on the platforms instrument within the IFC. And the platforms are effectively a kind of mechanism whereby there are multiple investments all under the one umbrella, controlled under the one sort of investment lens, and there are a whole bunch of conditions attached to that. And the idea is that by putting everything together in the platform, it offers you the opportunity to access a whole bunch of people within the private sector that you ordinarily wouldn't see as a default IFC client, because the threshold numbers for IFC are generally pretty high. So in our evaluation, what we actually found is that there were 2 things that were really telling. One of which is there was enormous skepticism that many of those smaller companies had the capacity and willingness to be able to meet the ESF framework or ESG framework for IFC in regards to meeting the threshold and being able to actually go through the process of putting themselves across the bar. So that was one thing. The second thing was the additional risk that you took on when you took on companies that were relatively new to a sector and that were actually, the loan was of a certain size that ordinarily wouldn't be IFC. And there were two things that we found. One of which was that, in fact, many of those new clients that would not have been able to access IFC funds without the platform instrument were no greater risk at all. In fact, if anything, the risk was lower for those that were included in the platforms than otherwise. Why? Because there was actually more money given over to the supervision of the platform instrument, which meant that you effectively had hand-holding that took place within the platform that enabled many of these new businesses to thrive and grow and be able to pay attention to what they were doing. So that's one thing. On the flip side, they were also able to meet many of the conditions that were being imposed upon them in terms of IFC. And I think the reason for that is that there was a relatively easy narrative to sort of play out with regards to what were the benefits. And the benefits were access to new markets, being able to go into formalized situations that they weren't in before, cross-transboundary investment opportunities that didn't exist before. So there are a whole range of different things that came out of that they saw as an inherent benefit of having IFC branding that happened through the platform's approach, but also being able to claim that they're actually a socially responsible company doing the right thing. So that was really interesting. At a more micro level, I want to give you an example, and the reason I think this is important is because I think Sven touched on the idea of needing to think differently about evaluation, and I completely agree. We've got to think differently and more creatively about engaging the private sector on the evaluation side. So recently my colleagues have begun to do field assessments of individual investments for IFC. They're called Project Performance Assessment Reports. And they will go to an investment in Brazil, which is one of the recent ones, a pharmaceutical company. They will visit the company, and as Sven pointed out, this doesn't happen very often, so the fact that it's happening is a great thing. But they go there and they get the show and tell, and they walk through the plant, and they're told how amazing IFC is because IFC gave us this money, and look at this, all these white walls and the amazing medicines that we're producing. How can this not be a great way that IFC spent their money? And I remember reading their first report, which was actually on a different topic, but it's about 24 months ago or thereabouts. And I remember at the time challenging them, and I said, okay, in that instance, are you getting an evaluative take on whether actually this company is improved as a consequence of the IFC? And sort of they got terribly offended, and then they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, okay, well, where's your counterfactual? So what we've recently begun to look at is looking at, okay, so what are comparators? And to give you a very concrete example, we actually had a bunch of textile factories or small-scale textile producers in Nepal. Now, this is actually not IFC investment. It was a broader livelihoods project that the bank was funding. But what we looked at there is actually going to a number of the providers that met ESF protocols versus those that didn't. And what we actually found is that the productivity of employees at those that met the ESF threshold, 23% higher. So for me, what's so interesting in that evaluation context is that you're effectively arguing for why being as socially responsible and absorbing the conditionality that comes with many of our institutions can actually enhance the profitability of your firm. But we've got to have a better pitch. And I think that's the thing that we often miss, is we don't think about the justification on the commercial side. We only talk about it on the kind of the narrative side or the socially responsible side, and I think that's a missed opportunity. So I think they're the two most obvious examples that I can draw upon recently. I guess the only last thing I would want to say in regards to this is I think there's also real opportunities, as Henrique pointed out, with regards to thinking much more creatively about how we use new technologies to get far greater reach in regards to our engagement with the private sector. And I think on this one, it definitely aligns well with your point that you make about young people. You know, I think in bringing young evaluators through, we've got to think about debunking the notion that evaluation works in a particular way and be much more open to creativity and taking different directions on evaluation. And I think private sector engagement, in that sense, offers enormous opportunity. So back to you, Sohini.
Just to follow up on that point, Chris, and maybe I'll, because you always ask the hard questions, that's what I've noticed in the conference, so maybe I'm going to prod you a little bit more. So just to kind of think about M&E side of things, right? So you mentioned about how evaluations need to be rethought, how you gave the example of asking the question about what the counterfactual is. So my question is, in AW, we have been talking a lot about how evaluations can be a learning opportunity, not just for, compliance side of things. And I think a lot of discussion still in the private sector is more on the compliance side and less on the learning side. So if you could talk a little bit about how we can motivate private sector and help them understand more about using M&E as a learning opportunity.
So, good question. I have this conversation with Marie Gada often, who's the head of 3IE. And we often talk about the link between impact evaluation and cost-benefit analysis. And so my fear, in many ways, in regards to impact evaluation, is that without the cost-benefit angle, I worry that the impact evaluation is an end in itself. And for me, in that sense, it's a little the same in terms of this issue for the private sector. I think it was interesting when Sven was talking, I kind of drew a little matrix on my page here to kind of give me a sense of, so what does this mean to how I think about the necessary parts of doing evaluation in the private sector. And what struck me is it does align again to the electricity access evaluation that I talked about a little earlier. So what we're looking at in that evaluation is by necessity comparisons between different models of operation and trying to get the bottom of which of those are the most productive and which have the best payoffs. And so in that sense, it's an imposed economic issue that you're dealing with through the evaluation process. Now, part of this is also about how do you most quickly and scale up and get to 300 million people as quickly as you can. But the second part to that is the creativity that you then have to think about in regards to how you measure things. So one of the conversations we've had with the electricity global practice on this evaluation is very much about inferred contributions to the SDGs. So how do you begin to make calculations for private sector investments in electricity that may not only be about access? And for those that are familiar, you can imagine that a huge proportion of investment funds from IFC and probably many of our development partners goes to solar panels on roofs. And normally that's tier 1 and 2. But what's so fascinating in that is there is this tension in a way between the human right that RJ talks about, RJ Banga, the president of the World Bank, around the human right to electricity versus what is the best way to get light. And I've got to say this is something I take away from my PhD studies many, many years ago. You're not worried about the electricity, you're worried about the light. So if you get the light, you don't care where it comes from. And I think sometimes we've got to think much more in that context about what choices are we making, and with our evaluation, are we better able to articulate the right choices and the economic payoffs that are going to lead to better choices for the private sector? Because frankly, we have an enormous advantage here. The private sector are very good at marketing, and they're very good at actually market research. But what they're often not very good at is taking a creative or alternative angle on the sectors or the industry that they're in. And that's because the vast majority of their time is saturated within that technological space. And the great thing about evaluators, we spend our whole lives thinking about multiple things. Back to you.
So if I can come to you, Sven, and here we were talking a lot about IFC, so maybe maybe if you can revisit your IFC days and talk a little bit about maybe examples where lessons from M&E helped private sector think about how they are doing, ESG practices, and if you want to talk about a few examples.
Yeah. Before that, so we should actually link up because we just completed an energy access evaluation. And interestingly there, one of the findings was, and that links well to your earlier question, is that sometimes in the development cooperation space, development partners, funders impose certain areas this is the space for private sector. So for instance, off-grid solar home systems, pico PVs, solar water pumps. From the German side, they said, well, this is the space for where the private sector should come in. They didn't question, that the large part of energy access is through the state company. It's on grid. And they, in the countries at least in Africa that we visited, they don't have to bother at all about revenues. It's state subsidies, and it's an instrument of power, obviously. But and then sometimes as the evaluators, you need to question also, well, is here the right rationale actually applied? So why should the private sector come into a space where the state is saying, oh my God, this is too difficult. That's too remote, it's too costly. So why should that work for the private sector? So I think, asking this question also as evaluators and challenging whether the funders are actually pushing or trying to push the private sector into spaces where they don't really want to go. And then no wonder that it doesn't really work. So. But then just briefly, for IFC, it's 7 years ago, and I spent 7 years there. I guess for every positive example, there's at least one negative or more than one. So that's the big disclaimer. I'll skip one, which is very similar to what you actually said, where we worked with an MFI in Peru, and where we then saw employee productivity and satisfaction on the job actually went up. And the other one, interestingly, because it blends a bit my point about RCTs, was I was working in sub-Saharan Africa on mobile money, so digital financial services, financial inclusion. And the operations side said, well, they kindly invited me to come along when they did their due diligence, diagnostics, and they said, well, you know what, now we're going to visit Tigo, Airtel, MTN, and the other guys. But Sven, so first of all, shut up about impact. Don't talk at all, at least, best would be, or if you talk, don't mention any of your fancy words. And by the way, we'll bet, and actually I had a bet on a bottle of wine. You're not going to do any evaluations and nowhere ever an RCT. But then in Uganda and Zambia, actually we found out that this is what they found interesting, right? They were developing a new product, digital financial services, a mobile wallet, and they didn't really know which areas to go to. They had some issues about KYC, customer data, how to really design the product. And then the ESG specialist also came in, and we said, okay, let's, and that's actually one of the very few cases, because it's not just 1 and 1, but it's one positive and probably a million cases where ESG and M&E are not working hand in hand. But in that case, we said, okay, what are the data requirements for ESG? What are the data requirements on monitoring, and what do we need to make this product successful and do the experimentation side? So we, together with the IT department of that mobile operator, we created that one database, which then was gold, because it it could be used for multiple purposes, and we could use it then also for, in the end, what interested the client, making the product better. So, but as I said, you know, I don't know, hopefully it has changed in the 7 years that I haven't been there, but what I always found quite disappointing that ESG specialists would go separate from monitoring and evaluation specialists. But in the end, sort of you're coming with the same burden on the client, right? You're coming with data reporting requirements, data collection, and so on. So I think to make this successful for the clients, join this up. And a last point, you know, this we can only get to a certain level with this unless we somehow, and I don't know how, fix the issue you pointed to, right? You've got 1 trillion ESG indicators and definitions. In German Development Cooperation, there are multiple definitions of additionality, which leads to that nobody actually is able to tell a story about additionality or measure it. We did some work at OECD level a couple of years back to come up with joint definitions of additionality. But in the end, it's really political, and it's really hard. And I don't have maybe anyone here has a solution to that. But maybe we can use AI to come up with the perfect and politically viable definition and set of indicators. But we need to fix that, because otherwise we're collecting and we're using data in a system which is in the end dysfunctional.
I have like a couple of questions, and then I would love to hear from the audience the questions that they have on this. So I hear you, Sven, you have, I think early you mentioned about your skepticism when it comes to SDG financing. So I'm not going to ask you that question, but maybe if I can ask Henrique, so through the work that you have done at NDB, if you could talk a little bit on how you have been thinking about fostering private sector's contribution towards SDG financing.
Thank you. I'll take some links of the additionality that was mentioned here. What we and also the energy sector. We did an evaluation of energy sector again, as I said, in the inner of the country, and it was different from the rooftops. It was like big companies providing services. And then we start to see what's the additionality, what's being taught, what's being passed to people, what did you do to them? And they say, we gave some training for them to operate turbines. And I say, yeah, but then we talk to people. Did you get the training? Yes, I did. And what did you learn? I learned something, but they will never hire me because I don't have I just have this training for this 20 hours, and then I'm not qualified enough to work there. And then we went to the company, said, how many people you hire from the local community? And they said, one, that's the security guard. So then we go back and to another company, another project, and ask, what did you provide? And they said, no, we teach women in the city to make cookies. And then they can put it in the market, and they go to the fair every Sunday and they sell the cookies. And then we start, okay, let's go back to the companies and see what they can do different, why they're doing this and why they're not doing something meaningful or something related to ESG, to SDGs. And then they said, no, when you do the project, you just come to us and ask us what you want, because we don't have time to think. Our core business is another thing. Our core business is solar panel. Our core business is not ESG, our core business is not SDG, our core business is not. Our core business is, that's not their words, but make money selling our product, right? That's their core business. And that's when we can enter as multilateral development banks and as public sector and so on, and evaluators. That's our recommendation. In one of our evaluations, we say, just go and sit together with the private sector before and tell them what they should do. And then we went again with the private sector, and if we tell you to do something, some technical cooperation to teach people not to throw trash in the floor, things like that, would you do? They said yes. Unless it's not far away from what we do, we have no problems. And then they gave one example to us. They said, no, one government asked us to make some water cisterns to collect water from the rain, and we don't know how to do that, and we will not do that. And I said, okay, this we will not do, but any other thing that it's on the core of your business, you can do that. I said, yes. So this is one of the recommendations, one of concrete recommendations we gave to our teams inside the bank. Say, go and talk to private sector and look for additionality, and additionality that's useful not only for the bank, but for the country and for the communities. Not making cookies, not training that you not be hired by the company. So this is one of the things that we recommended, and we understand our operations teams are start doing. But I will make one point that I always make in every conference. We usually here most of us are evaluators, and we are talking to evaluators, and like we are like in a therapy session that we complain, we hear our complaint, we feel embraced, we understand each other, but then the message doesn't go further. So we need to make the message go further. When we make our conference, our evaluation conference, we need to bring staff and people from our institutions or from governments to listen to us. Even we have representatives from government, the government's representative here from evaluation. This year, luckily, I have some colleagues that came here because the conference is in Shanghai, so they came, they listened. But this is one thing we need to learn how to do, like how to communicate our evaluation findings, and not our evaluation findings only one seminar, one short seminar, 5 minutes, listen to their questions. How to keep disseminating it in a way that people will understand and not see as we are giving them lectures, because then also the other problem, we communicate as we're giving lectures and they say, we know that, it's okay, let's move with our KPIs and targets in the institution.
And maybe my one last final question is to Chris. So Chris, we have been talking a lot about multilateral organizations in this panel. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how the partnerships between government and private sector can also be strengthened to better achieve SDGs, if you have thoughts on that.
Okay, so I think the real challenge is very much some of the things that have come up in today's discussion, which is scale. So we differ dramatically in regards to what we have to offer. And what struck me when I was thinking about the different concrete examples of work that we've done in the evaluation space, of projects that have happened within the World Bank, particularly those that are joint between World Bank, IFC, and MEGA, which is the guarantee section of the organization. They're enormous scale. And so I think what the World Bank is able to do in its convening capacity at a government level is very different from what other agencies are able to do in regards to getting things done. I think what strikes me as a major limitation with many of these organizations is that we believe sort of inherently in the idea of fungibility across the organization, which means that if you've been posted in Azerbaijan, your next posting can be in Sydney, responsible for the Pacific, and things will be transferable, the skill set. And I think it's a fatal error in many ways, because what is actually required in opening a dialogue about private sector in the Pacific is completely different from what is required for Central Asia. And so for me, one of the things that I think multilaterals need to do better is to kind of understand this sort of tiered response that it takes to the different governments that are its shareholders, but also to better understand our partners and other organizations and what role they have to play in that. So speaking of NDB, my boss and I sat down with one of your NDB colleagues over lunch today, and he's I think intern or relatively junior in the organization, and he came this afternoon because he found a window of opportunity and he was able to come along, which is great. And what was so interesting in the conversation is we were talking very much about the structure there and the overlap between the different organizations and the sudden tsunami of, yeah, but what does everyone offer? What is different? What does everyone offer? And I don't know that there's been that much consideration for that. So returning to the academia side of things, maybe that's something that we could look at in a little more detail. I think my last point on this is that the convening aspect of organizations differs dramatically according to the relationship and the perception of the different multilaterals. For those that know the World Bank and for those that may have traveled to Latin America, the World Bank is not super popular down there. And so to presume that the World Bank is going to sit at the table and have negotiations around what the private sector should do in Brazil is a dramatic stretch. And so I think a little more pragmatism and a little bit more realism is what I would argue for in regards to the role that multilaterals play. The entry points, I think, need much more work. And we've just done another piece of evaluation on the different diagnostic tools that IFC prepares leading into a country strategy for the World Bank. And what we found there is that most of the diagnostics were pretty much, motherhood and apple pie. And I don't mean that in a super negative way, but they were trying to cover everything. So where the diagnostics were not particularly good is identifying the comparative advantage or the entry point for the different countries in regards to private sector engagement with the IFC. And I think that for me is the really telling factor is I think we've got to get better as an organization at understanding our limitations and our entry points. I know that I think ADB is kind of going through this process at the moment of reform where they're actually seeing the benefit of sending more people to the field. And I think that's a super interesting aspect. The World Bank has gone through that. We did an evaluation on the carbon footprint a number of years ago, and we found it makes a massive difference, particularly to the IFC part of the business. And so, interestingly, that was where it stood out much more than the bank side. So I think there's sort of three angles on your question.
To all of you, I think now I turn to the audience members. So if you want to raise your hand, come up to the mic, make a line and ask your questions. And maybe introduce yourself as well.
My name is Harten from Mongolian Evaluation Association. But for this time, I'm going to wear my different hat from the private sector. So in last 1 year ago, I was asked by one of the biggest corporations in Mongolia to become their board member in charge of ESG. So now I've been chairing the ESG committee in that corporation. So I have just going to share some of my observation in the past 1 year from the private sector perspective, and what evaluators we can do, play the role, and we have big job there. So the reason why they asked to be on their board is they were looking for somebody who knows SDG, somebody who has good ethical background, ethics. So I said, okay, why don't because I've been having some interest in ESG in the past 2 years, like social impact measurement and ESG. So as a first message, as evaluators, we have a very good chance to become in the ESG world, being very the bridge between the private sector and the evidences, because we are in the nexus of many paths. And the second point is, you've been talking about from the MDB side, how you maybe convince the private sector to integrate ESG or M&E. But from the private sector, what I've been seeing out there is challenges. They have some intention to incorporate, to be good in the ESG. However, the first challenge is there's maybe no real motivation, because GRI, SASB, these are not legally binding in our country at the moment. Only when they talk about ESGs, when they would like to get loans from MDBs, like EBRD, ADB, because you require some of the checklists, ESG reports should be there, right? So last year, I was involved in producing the ESG report second time in that corporation. But what I have observed is it's not full scope of ESG, like not even going to the double materiality assessment, only maybe at the material assessment, because to have the full scope of all the material assessment, you have to go to the value chain of all the value chain supply, asking the vendors, asking the producers all the data, but they don't have that capacity. They don't collect their data at the lower level. So at the moment, the private sectors, unless there is this, if the MDBs are requiring and you want their cooperation with you, also you need to think about the capacity building of how they report ESG properly, even including all the supply chains of them, so they will have a better, fuller picture of ESG. Yeah, so I think that's just my personal reflection, and then I also encourage our fellow evaluators to think about ESG as your additional role, because the market really look after us. Yeah, thanks very much.
Remember what Henrique said. You can ask him anything. His bosses are not here.
Okay, so maybe if someone wants to.
Yes, if I just want to react to that, like one less romantic reply and one more romantic reply is that you can attract the private sector as this is the less romantic if the cost is competitive. So if you can put the targets, you can put, and if you have lower cost of borrowing, the private sector will go for the money, and they will adapt, and they will do everything in the SDG, ESG that's expected from them. This is the less romantic. Of course, the trade-off, the cost of producing these reports shouldn't be that high and shouldn't be a burden, and they don't need to hire additional people. But a more romantic reply. Yes, you have to provide training. So training is important. You can have these conditions and you provide the training. And one way of breaking this down is you have the training, you have capacity building, as you said. So you provide the capacity building together with training as part of the law, and then the cost can be mitigated. And you have to convince them that the marketing part of being responsible it will pay off, and that their profitability will go up. So studies are really important. Things that the think tanks are doing, academia again are doing, showing off that okay, ESG and responsible investments are more profitable, and the new generations will buy more green, clean products. Then the market will accept it. We are seeing a pushback lately, as you've seen in the news. The hedge funds are deviating from green development or for green growth and for green bonds and for green investment because they are seeing less and less return. So this comes back to my first non-romantic. Everything's related to cost. If the costs worth, the private sector will be there. Otherwise, they'll not come for the borrowing.
So, I mean, just to kind of wrap up the conversation that we have been having. So I think for me, in terms of if I have to summarize the discussions, and if I have to summarize in two lines, the discussions we have been having for the last 1.5 hours. I think for me, what I really learned in today's discussion is first, it is important to speak the language of the private sector, speak less of jargon, and to be able to contribute better. I learned the value of bringing in young and emerging evaluators to the discourse, not just the MDBs and the private sector, but also I think to the point that Chris mentioned in the end about the value of partnerships and building partnerships, that, you know, it is important to have diagnostic tools, but develop diagnostic tools that are almost not a kitchen and sink model where they ask everything and anything under the sun, but they ask questions that help us understand where our limitations are to be able to contribute better. But maybe if we can go maybe to everybody, and maybe if you want to talk about your last opening, maybe takeaways, your last closing takeaways, I beg your pardon, and if you were to summarize the discussions that we have been having, how would you do that?
Again, as my last reflection, I think we, first as evaluators, we need to communicate what we found out, and we need to communicate in a clear way. And we not only communicate, we have to propose also things. We don't need only to find out what we found out. We have to also provide some comments, or provide some positive feedbacks, or provide some action plans. In some institutions are more difficult than the others, but we always can nudge at least the way forward. We again, as public institutions, we don't have many time to, or many space to fail. So that's the space where academia, NGOs, civil society, young evaluators, the use of IT. We have amazing panels from Sven showing the use of AI and the importance of bringing these young people with this knowledge. And again, the young people play this double role. One as evaluator, one as AI, and the next one as consumers that will have this, buy these ESG, SDGs products. So this is my final words. Thank you.
Gosh, that's hard to follow. I mean, completely agree with the point of young and emerging evaluators. One sort of task for us still to do, us specifically DEval and our partners, we're just producing a guidebook on country-led SDG evaluations, but that guidebook is targeting governments mainly. Development partners could be used by colleagues here in the room as well in MDBs. But I think in the third edition, we should tailor this guidebook to the private sector, because to my knowledge, sort of private sector-led SDG evaluations, then there's also not so much guidance out there. So understanding for the private sector the role of their investments and how this is relevant to SDGs, and how that made changes to the business. So this is sort of reverting a bit from we need to change as evaluators. I mean, with some proper guidance and that guidebook, perhaps also we can nudge private sector a bit. And we've been starting to work with private sector evaluation companies, though, on footprint evaluations, which is another tool to look at other sort of environmental impacts. So I think there are some tools already available from all of us here and our colleagues around the world that can be useful if pitched rightly to the private sector. So this is one side, and then another one. You mentioned this twice, I think, and just wanted to underline this. I think guarantees and investment guarantees, different forms of guarantees have an enormous potential, and to some extent, I mean, MIGA is huge, but then still for bilaterals, still some untapped potential to be used really to support private sector investments. And the Swedish have, for instance, an interesting guarantee model that can be used. So I think, picking up on certain instruments, there are regulations that need to change so that we can have better structured funds, better blended finance instruments for one, and then working on the guarantee side would be sort of two instrument types of things that I would like to see stronger in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so really enjoyed the conversation. I think Henrique touched on the point earlier, which has sort of struck me as important. We often come to the echo chamber of evaluation conferences and talk and self-congratulatory, pat each other on the back about how wonderful our evaluations are. And I think he touches on a really important point there, is that, again, within the business world, evaluation is a means to an end. And that end is very often an orientation towards improving their bottom line. And I think it's really fundamental that we as evaluators kind of understand that what we're pitching to the various audiences align with their way of thinking. And I think this is something that I have constantly talk about with my own staff, but I think it's also important in many ways. I think this is the first conference I've been to in 7 years, and part of the reason for that is I tend to agree with your position. I think it's good that we get methodological challenge and critique, but I also think that one of the biggest gaps in evaluation is our ability to market ourselves and our findings. And that means you've got to frame them and package them much more in an alignment with who the audience is. And I think that's something that has come through pretty strongly today and I think is important. The last thing I just want to point out as a sort of a segue or an end point is the fact that there is an acknowledgement within these institutions that it is an issue. So in the World Bank, RJ has just instituted a private sector advisory panel. And I'm happy to say that my very first boss of my very first job in an investment bank in Australia, Macquarie Bank, is actually on that panel. I think the $64 million that she made last year is a little more than she was earning when she was actually in charge of me as a minion coming out of a university in Australia. But what is really interesting in that is there is a very real sense that there is a tendency for many of our multilaterals to kind of be too inward in regards to our understanding of what is required and what's needed. And so this advisory panel is meant to be a kind of a way into, or a map, if you like, to engaging the private sector in a dialogue about what we're doing well and what we're not doing so well. And I think that's a really important part. And should you be interested, then you could certainly go and have a look at the advisory panel. And I should say, we're about to undertake an ESF evaluation in IEG, which is on the bank side, the public sector. But we've also just done an ESG sector highlights, because ESG actually in the World Bank group is probably far more amplified and significant in the IFC than it actually is in the bank. It certainly is in terms of its evaluative aspect or an angle. So we invest much more in IEG on the ESG side than we do on the ESF side. And I think that's an interesting telling point. I'm not sure how much value we're getting from that, but I think it is interesting that that's been something that we've invested in historically. Back to you, Sohini.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I think please join me in thanking all the three wonderful panelists. I think they did a fabulous job in really explaining the role of the private sector towards SDG. There is a feedback form that is there, so we would love to hear your feedback. By we, I mean ADB would want to hear the feedback that you have for the session. And thank you for joining this afternoon session. Thanks, everyone.